Hi, this is D.L. Young. The following story is entitled The Reader, and it's a tale about a boy with the remarkable ability to see through any deception. A talent that, it seems, is equally a curse as a blessing. Now, this short story has a very special place in my heart. For one, it was a finalist in the Writers of the Future contest, and it was also one of the featured stories in the science fiction anthology Tides of Possibility. The story also marks my transition from a short story writer to a novelist. You see, The Reader is the story that I took and expanded because I wanted really to explore that world a little bit more, and I made it into a novel. My first novel, Soledad, is basically a novelized version of the short story The Reader. Except one little change I made. In the story The Reader, the protagonist is a young boy. For Soledad the novel, I changed the protagonist into a 20-year-old woman. Anyway, enjoy the story. The Reader. The future didn't look very bright for our dinner guest, a smooth-talking cowboy who'd just arrived. Like so many others who came before him with high hopes to cut a deal, he was all handshakes and grins. He sat on the far side of the carnival-sized tent we used as our traveling cafeteria, sharing a simple dinner of beans and tortillas with a dozen or so of Flaco Guzman's retinue. The cowboy grinned and made small talk. I watched him and felt bad for him while I waited for the yerba to take effect. I had a feeling tonight's reading would go the wrong way, and that feeling was rarely wrong. A couple hours earlier, we'd made camp after a long day's ride. I wasn't sure of our location. Out of caution, we never took the same route twice. But I guessed we were somewhere between Eagle Pass and San Antonio. That would have put us roughly halfway across the 150-kilometer stretch of West Texas desert connecting Guzman's nat gas territories. Scrub brush to the horizon in all directions, the occasional glimpse of a coyote or snake, and the nearly unbearable August heat that mercifully turned cool and comfortable each evening. The yerba hit me like a hammer, and I shuddered. Even after years of using it, that first moment of intense clarity, when the weed's drug grabbed hold, still managed to surprise me. A blurry reality slammed into sharp focus, and your brain kicked into a different gear. Suddenly, you saw everything. Every facial twitch, every nervous blink and lip quiver. A universe of details that were always there, but you normally wouldn't pick up on. Not consciously, anyway. And if you looked hard and long enough at someone, it was like being inside their skin. Like every breath they took was your own. The moment the yerba's clarity overcame me, I was instantly uncomfortable. A deep suspicion emanated from Guzman's men and hung heavy in the air, so thick I could almost feel it on my skin. I saw 1,000 things at once. All those little things I wouldn't have noticed otherwise. Eyes darted back and forth, neck muscles tightened, vocal cords strained ever so slightly. I pushed out all of the noise and focused on the cowboy so I could get a good read. "My daddy goes way back with Flaco's people," he said, trying too hard to make us feel comfortable. He's hiding something. One of Guzman's hulking bodyguards nodded and slapped a steaming spoonful of beans onto a tortilla. "You don't say," he grunted. "Oh, hell yes. My people worked with his father during secession. Even helped him divvy up the nat gas concessions." He laughed, a forced, fake laugh, and then said, "Of course, back then the families were all pretty much even Steven." And in the years since, the Guzman clan has grown powerful while his own family squandered their concession. The cowboy left the rest of the thought unspoken, but I saw it all over his face. The world around me faded into the background as I studied him. I began to see all the lies. There were so many. Lies within lies within lies. A spider's web of deceit few could have spun with such ease and grace. The cowboy was a practiced, expert liar. One of the best I'd seen. I watched him, like I'd watched so many others, digging their graves one lie at a time. There was never any shortage of them. The hustlers and freelancers who'd give anything to sit where the cowboy sat now. An audience with Flaco Guzman was the opportunity of a lifetime. One good deal with him could set you up for life. But what these fast talkers didn't know, what they never knew, was that Guzman had a secret weapon stacking the odds in his favor. A living, breathing bullshit detector. Come on, cowboy, you're blowing it. You want those stale tortillas and beans to be your last meal? Don't you know if you keep up this bullshit, they're going to walk you out into the desert and bury you there? Before I knew it, half an hour had passed. More than enough time to see what I needed to. Flaco Guzman appeared at the edge of the tent, and all conversation abruptly stopped. At nearly 2 meters tall and pushing 140 kilos, I'd always thought Guzman looked more like a professional wrestler than a nat gas baron. As he entered the tent, his men shot up out of their chairs like soldiers at attention. "Don Flaco!" the cowboy boomed. "Wonderful to see you." He rose and took a step toward Guzman, but one of the bodyguards stopped him with a firm hand on the shoulder. Guzman ignored the cowboy, turned to me, and raised his eyebrows. "Well?" I turned away from the cowboy so I wouldn't see his reaction. It was an ugly thing to watch, the way a person's face changed the moment they realized they were going to die. Again, Guzman asked, "Well, brujo?" I answered with a small shake of my head. Then Guzman snapped his fingers and motioned toward the desert. The bodyguards knew the drill, instantly seizing the cowboy by the arms. They dragged him, kicking and screaming and pleading for his life, out into the darkness. A minute later, I heard the gunshots. The next morning, the sun blazed down as the caravan snaked its way through the desert, pack mules and horses and camels stretching out in a long, thin line. There were maybe 100 of us, roughly a dozen of Guzman's inner circle, 5 or 6 mistresses, and the rest a gaggle of handlers and workers. Guzman had an obsession with Pancho Villa, the Mexican revolutionary who thumbed his nose at a gringo army that hunted him for 2 years across this very same desert. Guzman even emulated Villa's look, sporting the thick mustache and crisscross bandoliers you saw in all the old photos. His men followed suit, out of deference, donning the wide-brimmed hats and the loose, functional clothes of desert-wandering revolutionaries. He could have made the trip connecting his nat gas territories in his jet in half an hour. But a 3 days ride across the desert had some kind of romantic attraction to him. Got him in touch with his Mexican roots, he liked to say. The security logistics were a nightmare, but Guzman had the tech and the manpower to make it happen. We were protected on all sides by Guzman clan militia, hundreds of men and vehicles shadowing our movements just out of eyesight so as not to spoil the caravan's historical look and feel. And Guzman's drones, also never seen nor heard, kept a constant vigil from high overhead. Strangely enough, our little desert convoy was probably the safest place in the Republic. Guzman usually had me do a reading the second day in, and if it went badly, the desert offered the perfect location for dealing with the problem. Buzzards and ants took care of any recognizable evidence in a few days. Not that anyone in their right mind would go searching through that hell on earth anyway. "Hey, brujo!" the horse groom called, moving his black mare alongside and looking my dromedary up and down. "Why do you ride a camel? Doesn't it hurt your ass?" Only someone on their first caravan would ask something so stupid. "Pecking order," I said sharply and pointed forward. "Inner circle rides up front on horseback, the rest of us camelback it in the rear." And yes, it hurt my ass. But I wasn't about to tell this nosy cabron that. The groom flashed me a confused look. "I'm not family," I said. "I was adopted from another territory." I pulled up my sleeve and showed him the tracker implant scar on my forearm. The groom nodded,
So you couldn't go back home even if you wanted to, eh?
Like I had a home to go back to. Up ahead, one of the bodyguards had stopped his horse to one side of the caravan. As we passed by, he sidled up next to me and shot the groom a harsh look. The groom understood at once and spurred his horse forward out of earshot.
Don Flaco wants another reading tonight, the bodyguard said.
Another one? I still had cobwebs from the yerba I chewed last night.
Is that a problema, brujo?
I'm not a brujo, you fucking peasant. The bodyguard smiled.
So I tell him no? I can tell him no if you like.
The bodyguards were mostly illiterates from Michoacan. They didn't understand what I did, calling me a brujo, a witch doctor. More than a few of them wouldn't have minded seeing me walked out into the desert to get rid of my black magic forever. Just tell me what time I need to be ready, I said. The air that night was cool and crisp, the kind of peaceful desert evening I might have enjoyed if Guzman's temper hadn't just erupted.
Why would you say something stupid like that?
Guzman stared harshly at his trade advisor, Sanchez, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The two men sat across a folded card table covered with stacks of papers. I sat on a stool in the corner of the tent, waiting for them to finish. Sanchez spoke slowly and carefully.
Don Flaco, I apologize if I wasn't clear. With the Cadena acquisition, we now control roughly half of the nat gas production in the Republic. The expansion of our territories over the last year has been incredible, but if we continue to grow so fast, we may spread ourselves thin. We're already having difficulty maintaining security in some areas. And your recommendation is that I make like a turtle and hide my head in my shell?
Guzman stroked his mustache and considered. He nodded toward me and said,
Brujo, what do you think?
I knew better than to disagree, so I shrugged and said, Best defense is a good offense. Guzman slapped the table, sending papers flying.
You see? Even the boy knows we have to keep moving forward. Now go on to dinner. No more of this talk about playing safe.
The trade advisor awkwardly agreed, shot me a go-to-hell look, and left the tent. Guzman winked at me.
He may be right, you know,
he said calmly, the anger suddenly gone from his face. He took out his pipe and packed it with tobacco.
We've come so far so fast. Maybe a bit too fast. Come over here, brujo.
The show for Sanchez was classic Guzman. Even in dealings with his inner circle, he preferred to keep everyone off balance at all times, uncertain of his motives, his reasons, his thinking in general. No one, neither his worst enemy nor his closest ally, ever really knew what he might be up to. And he clearly liked it that way. He was even careful enough to avoid being present whenever I did a reading. Flaco Guzman's reputation was that of an unpredictable brute, obsessed with conquest, indiscriminate fucking, and the destruction of rival clans. But the man I knew hardly fit that description. He was anything but reckless. The brutal part? Yes, that was totally accurate. But then we lived in brutal times. Guzman ran a match over the pipe and puffed, filling the tent with the sweet smell of his favorite Veracruzano tobacco.
Did you hear what he said, brujo? Half the nat gas in the Republic. Not bad for the grandson of a farmer, eh?
I walked over and sat down. Your grandfather was a farmer?
Well, do poppies count as farming?
Guzman chuckled.
Pero en serio. Beautiful country where my grandfather lived, brujo. Seems like a lifetime ago.
He took long draws from his pipe while he told me about the mountain village of his childhood, how his biggest worry in those days was whether or not he'd catch a bigger trout than his cousins. He reminisced for some time, and in moments like these, he seemed the most humble and simple of souls, hardly a man of great power. dreaded and feared by so many. It was at times like these that I found myself almost fond of Guzman. And for a few precious moments, as I listened to his stories, sometimes I'd forget that I was a slave.
Malinalco, brujo. They really know how to cook a trout in Malinalco. You really should make a trip there someday.
He looked down at my tracking scar, and his smile faded.
Maybe we'll take the caravan there someday and you'll come with us.
Guzman shuffled some papers and began to talk business.
A man from the Chen Johnsons has come in from Amarillo to negotiate the sale of their concession.
I felt my mouth drop open. Maybe half wasn't enough for Guzman after all. The Chen Johnson clan controlled the largest nat gas concession. Their territory covered almost the entire panhandle, some 40,000 square miles sitting atop the richest gas fields in the Republic. If Guzman managed to make a deal with the Chen Johnsons, he'd hold every major gas play in the Republic. It would be an energy monopoly that not even the richest Saudis or emirs had ever had before their oil started to dry up. Guzman said nothing for several moments.
Trust,
he finally said.
Finding someone you can trust in this world is no small thing. You of all people should know how much I value trust, yes?
Of course, Don Flaco. He gazed at me coldly.
Do you know how they got Pancho Villa in the end? Someone he trusted betrayed him and let his enemies gun him down. A whole gringo army never managed to touch him, but a traitor, a single traitor close to him, did him in.
I swallowed hard, understanding the implication. Don Flaco, I said. I have no family or friends left in Chen Johnson territory. My loyalties are here, with you. I made sure I didn't blink. So many people blinked when they lied. Guzman stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment before speaking again.
I have a little birdie in the Chen Johnson clan who thinks the offer is some kind of trick to gain my confidence. Bait in the water to catch a big trout, entiendes?
I nodded, and he continued.
But some of my men think the deal's legit. I need to know if the offer is a lie, brujo.
The bodyguard who'd taken care of the cowboy appeared and said, Don Flaco, it's time. Moments later, I walked through the mosquito net curtains of the dining tent, and my blood ran cold as I recognized the visitor. I hadn't seen Abner Cunningham in 3 years. He was supposed to be dead, killed the same day my parents were killed. I'd just turned 17 the day a band of panhandle freelancers raided our home. That cramped little house my parents and I shared with Abner and his wife just outside Dalhart. It was literally the middle of nowhere, a lonely outpost on the western periphery of Chen Johnson territory, flat grasslands as far as you could see under a wide, cloudless sky. Mom had her doubts about being so far away from Amarillo, but the Chen Johnson security chief had assured us it was safe. Well inside protected territory, he'd insisted. For a geologist like Dad, the place was a paradise. Hundreds of gas fields to survey, hundreds of discoveries waiting to be made. Dad's passion was infectious. And despite the bleak landscape and lack of neighbors, I grew to love the place. Sometimes Dad let me tag along on surveys, and I'd hunt game while he and Abner, his apprentice in those days, took field readings. They'd always hoot and applaud whenever I returned to camp with a wide grin and a bag full of rabbits. Look at the big game hunter! Rabbit stew tonight, yes sir, thanks to our big game hunter! In the 2 years we lived there, they must have surveyed a couple hundred gas fields for the Chen Johnsons. When I didn't go out on surveys, Abner's wife Angeles gave me lessons on how to read people. A talented reader herself, she'd noticed early on I had the gift. You're 1 in 1,000, just like me, she'd say with a wink. It's something to be proud of, the ability to see lies. Very few have this gift. Even fewer know how to use it properly. She taught me everything she knew about using the yerba, the desert weed that enhanced the gift and allowed people like us to see the complex hidden language of facial tics, breathing rhythms, body posture, and the countless physical giveaways the conscious mind normally ignores. For anyone else, the yerba was just a bitter-tasting plant. But for those of us with the gift, the weed made us human lie detectors, far more accurate than any machine built for the same purpose. I'd become pretty good at spotting lies, and Angeles told me over time the gift would eventually become something more. In a few years, you'll be able to do more than just see a lie. You'll be able to see the truth. Do you understand the difference? I nodded, though I wasn't sure what she meant. Moments before it happened, Mom smiled at me while she prepared dinner. The delicious smell of Mom's chicken curry permeated the kitchen. Angeles was outside, hanging laundry to dry. "So tell me, my boy reader," Mom said, "are you good enough now to see what I'm thinking?" Mom always put together a special dinner when the men came back home. Dad and Abner were due back from their 3-day survey any time now. The yerba from my morning lesson hadn't quite worn off. I looked carefully at Mom's face and tried to see something. "You're happy they're coming back," I said. She laughed. "Anyone could have guessed I'm missing my husband. Is that the best you can do?" I stared harder and thought I saw a trace of something else. "You don't think I'm safe here," I said. My own words surprising me. She whirled around and looked at me crossly for a moment. Then her face relaxed, and she winked. "You're getting pretty good at that, my boy. Angeles has taught you well." Something outside caught her eye, and she turned to the window. "My God," she gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Her metal cooking spoon fell to the floor, clanking loudly against the tile. I looked out the window and saw Dad and Abner approaching, with a dozen strangers behind them. Mom grabbed me by the arm and pulled me toward the back of the house. "Mom, what's going on? Who are those men?" She yanked open the back door and shoved me out. A splintering crash came from the front of the house as someone kicked in the door. "Run and hide! Run and hide!" Mom shouted. I did as I was told, running in a panic to an outcrop of rocks behind the house. The freelancers found me a few minutes later, tying my hands and feet and throwing me over one of their horses. Gunshots rang out from inside the house, and I craned my neck around to see. 2 of the freelancers came out of the front door, mounted their horses, and joined us. "We just won the lottery," a short, fat man with silver teeth announced. "The boy's a reader." The men cheered their good luck and fired shots into the air in celebration. 2 days later, they sold me to the Guzman clan for their biggest payday ever. I entered the dining tent, and a shock of recognition came across Abner's face. He went pale and turned to Guzman's trade advisor seated next to him. "You told me Don Flaco didn't bring a reader with him on caravans." The trade advisor wiped some taco grease from his beard with a shirt sleeve and laughed. "If we told you a reader was going to be here, would you have come?" I forced myself to walk past Abner with little more than a glance, as my mind raced with 1,000 questions. How could he be alive? And if Abner were still alive, what about Mom and Dad? My head swam. I grabbed a plate of tacos and sat at the opposite end of the tent. The bitterness of the yerba I'd just chewed still filled my mouth, as I chatted distractedly with the horse groom and stole glances at Abner. What had happened that day they took me away? I heard the shots that killed Mom and Dad, the shots that ended all their lives, the shots that ended my life as well. The yerba hit, and a sudden wave of emotion crashed over me. The smell of Mom's curry filled my nose, and the gunshots rang out in my ears. For a moment, I lost where I was, and the groom must have noticed the change on my face.
"You all right, Brujo? You gonna be sick or something?"
I faked a coughing fit and tried to compose myself. "I'm fine." Angeles had once warned me that the drug could sometimes do that, bring back what she called sensory-rich memories, but I never imagined the flood of sensations could be so overwhelming. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I steeled myself and turned my gaze to Abner. He knew what was happening. He was self-conscious and jittery, and it made the read more difficult. But even so, it didn't take very long. Abner had always been an easy read, and that much hadn't changed. I knew in less than a minute the Chen Johnson offer was a lie. Then a sudden torrent of memories rushed through my mind. I saw a long-forgotten boy hunting through the brush, so proud and excited, as he walked back to camp with his catch. I saw the relief on his mother's face as he returned home after a week-long journey. I saw the boy learning about his gift under the patient guidance of his teacher. The boy couldn't have been happier, the only child of not just 2, but of 4 doting parents in that cramped little house. But there was something else underneath it all, something I could only see now. An unspoken ugliness all the grown-ups kept among themselves, hidden from the boy. And whatever it was, somehow I knew Abner was still hiding it from me. I calmed my mind and looked further into him. So deeply, I lost everything around me. An empty universe, except for Abner's face. And then, I was inside him. Deeper than I've ever been inside anyone. Further than I thought it was even possible to go. I felt the cold depths of Abner's most secret dread as the darkest corners of his mind began to unfold. Then I saw it. Hideous and unthinkable. Staring right at me. I closed my eyes and shook my head forcefully, not wanting to believe it. Guzman appeared at the edge of the tent and everyone stood. He came over and looked me up and down.
"You all right, Brujo?"
I nodded and shoved my hands into my pockets so he wouldn't see them trembling. He motioned toward Abner.
"Well, what about him?"
I remembered Guzman's words about trust and loyalty. His way of telling me not to fuck up tonight. But fuck up, I would. I cleared my throat and said, "He's clean. I guess the Chen Johnsons really do want to sell." The guard outside Abner's guest tent snored loudly as I crept past him. It was well past midnight. Abner sat up in his cot when I entered. "How'd you get in here?" I stood over him and glared, resisting the urge to wrap my hands around his neck and choke him. "No hello? No hug? No how wonderful to see you?" Abner looked to the ground, the shame plain on his face. "Why didn't you tell Guzman the truth?" he asked. "I wanted to talk with you. Can't very well do that if you're a corpse in the desert, can I?" Abner nodded grimly. "Angeles said you were the best she ever taught." He looked up at me. "I'm sorry, Maharth." Maharth. It seemed like a lifetime since someone had called me by my real name. Mom and Dad took me out there to the middle of nowhere so Angeles could train me, right? Develop the gift without anyone knowing about it. You were all in on it, raising me like some prize bull, and then selling me to those freelancers. I already knew the truth, but I wanted to hear him admit it. Abner lowered his head. "Yes." "So why fake the kidnapping? Why pretend they'd killed you?" Abner sighed. "Your parents thought it would be better if you thought we were all dead. so you wouldn't try to escape and come looking for us. I'd read it all in him earlier, so his words held no surprises, no new information. I wasn't sure why I'd come, or what I'd expected to get out of forcing his confession. Standing there in front of him, I felt only an emptiness, vast and lifeless like the desert that surrounded us. A voice behind me spoke.
Maharth, I'd almost forgotten your real name.
I whirled around to see Guzman. Don Flaco, I said. What are you doing? He waved me silent, frowned, and motioned to Abner.
I knew the offer was a lie before this one even got here. My little birdie is very reliable. Your reading was just a double check to confirm what I already knew.
A lump formed in my throat. Shit. Guzman said,
But you made me curious, Brujo. I wondered why this Chin Johnson cockroach would be worth you risking so much.
He called for the guard.
Take this hijo de puta out of here.
I winced, expecting the guard to grab me, but instead, he reached for Abner, yanked him off the cot, and took him away. The sounds of Abner's pleas filled the night air as the guard walked him out into the desert. When the shot rang out a minute later, I felt neither joy nor sadness, only the numb realization that I was next. Don Flaco and I stood alone in the tent. Where there should have been anger, I saw only, what? Sadness? Disappointment? Pity? Without the yerba, I couldn't know what he was thinking. Guzman shook his head and spit on the ground. He seemed to struggle for what to say.
Those freelancers told me you were an orphan. Did you know that?
I shook my head.
Well,
Guzman said,
I guess we both know the truth now.
He called in another guard and muttered something to him. I took a shaky breath and resigned myself to a walk in the desert. The guard grabbed my arm and said,
Hold still, this will sting a bit.
He placed a small box-like device over my tracker scar and held it firm. My arm tingled for a few seconds. Then the guard nodded and said,
Done, Don Flaco. It's deactivated.
Guzman sighed and said,
I think it's time for you to go and find a different life. Maharth.
For the next couple hours, I sat alone in my tent, the day's events whizzing through my mind like a movie on fast forward. I'd dreamed of having my freedom for so long. The sudden shock of actually having it left me dumb and speechless. 2 more days riding until we reached San Antonio. Then I'd be free to do what I wanted, to choose my own direction. But what direction? I had no friends to catch up with, no family who gave a damn, no past to return to. I left the tent and wandered around camp. The night air was quiet and peaceful. There were still a few fires going, and their fading embers gave everything a warm glow. A handful of guards and workers sat around the fires, talking in low tones. As I passed by, they stopped speaking and looked up at me. One of the guards, the one who'd taken care of Abner, motioned toward my arm.
Nice to have that thing out of you, yes? Where will you go now, Brujo?
I touched the tracker scar on my arm, then turned and made my way to Guzman's tent. He was still awake, and the guards let me through. I stepped through the mosquito netting, and Don Guzman looked up from his papers.
Yes? What is it, Maharth? Have you decided where you're going to go?
Don Flaco looked different. Or maybe he didn't look different, and it was just me seeing him differently. Seeing something in his face, something I didn't need the yerba to see. Something I might have seen all along, but only noticed now. In this world full of lies, finding someone you could trust was no small thing. Don Flaco, I said, my name isn't Maharth, it's Brujo, and Guzman territory is my home.